Finally, on the Bible, it also talks about things like angels and demons, which people point to as well. Obviously, that can't be true. I mean, what do you say to people?
All right, let's see it.
Well, I mean, it's starting with the assumption that the supernatural doesn't exist.
No, it isn't. It is overwhelmingly the conclusion that is drawn from all of the available data. It is the observation that the data unilaterally do not support the actual reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons. It's also the conclusion drawn from all the available data that we can account socioculturally, literarily, for the origins, the nature, the function of traditions about angels and demons. In other words, we can explain how they were invented and how they differ from culture to culture and from time to time and from place to place. There are no data that support the reality of angels and demons. And when people see that, it is perfectly reasonable and rational to therefore conclude that they don't actually exist. And the attempt to dismiss that conclusion based on all the available data as just an a priori assumption is an attempt to try to lower the findings of critical thought to the level of religious dogma and say, well, it's just a bias. It's on the same level as these religious dogmas. And we can see this because the rest of the video is not going to generate any kind of data or evidence whatsoever for the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons. Again, because none exist. It's just going to try to tear down scientific inquiry to make it seem like it is on equal footing with religious dogma, so that they can then say, well, we're on the same footing and we both have things we can't answer, therefore it's a wash. And that is an absolutely ridiculous bit of rhetorical prophylaxis for the fact that there are no data that support the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons. And even attempts to try to appeal to experience and witness testimony and things like that is going to run into trouble once you examine the witness testimony and you find that accounts of visitations by angels and demons differ wildly around the world, and where they are consistent is where they are staying tethered to the received tradition and the authoritative texts, which means they're only consistent where they already have inspiration from which to draw their accounts. In other words, the data all point to the same reasonable and rational conclusion that supernatural beings like angels and demons are a product of sociocultural invention. That's the conclusion that all of the data support. And that's why the only thing that West can do is attempt sophomorically to bring scientific inquiry down to the level of dogmatic religious belief.
And I simply, I don't think that's true.
But that is not a conclusion you arrived at based on the available data. It is a dogma you chose to accept in spite of the available data, which is why you cannot provide any data to support that conclusion. You can provide no mathematical equations, no computer simulations, no experimental data, no observational data. You can provide nothing. All you can provide is an attempt to use misinformation to cut down scientific inquiry and say they have gaps in their knowledge, therefore I don't have to account for the fact that there are no data that support the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons. It's an attempt to try to generate a sense of some kind of epistemological parity between the two worldviews and say, we're even, let's call it a draw. And that is wildly fallacious.
I mean, there are all sorts of things that, from, say, a secular materialistic perspective, are far more of needing an explanation than the existence of supernatural beings.
That is a laughable falsehood.
I mean, my friend Glenn Scrivener out in the UK, who runs an organization called Speak Life, he talks about this a lot, where, you know, there are things that atheists and secular materialists have to account for, things like everything coming from nothing, order coming from chaos, life emerging from non-life, minds from mindless matter.
All of these things are accounted for by atheists and secular materialists. There are explanations that are either widely accepted and long held and supported by experimental data, observational data, computer simulations, mathematical equations, and all that, or there are competing theories that are supported by those things, but still have some unanswered questions that leave us trying to figure out which of the available answers is right. So the notion that science is just unable to account for these things and the misrepresentation of some of these things, for instance, the standard cosmological model does not posit that the universe came from nothing, that's a religious belief. So that is a Christian saying, you've got to account for my theory of the origins of the universe, which is not how any of this works. We can account for these things with very robust explanations. Nobody can account for the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons in any other way but to just say the Bible says so. And people have claimed that they ran into them. And either it has nothing to do with what the Bible says about them, and therefore I ignore them entirely, or it is directly inspired by what the Bible says about them, therefore it matches what the Bible says, therefore it's more reliable testimony. The notion that scientific inquiry and the existence of angels and demons are on the same level, epistemologically speaking, in terms of available evidence, is just bafflingly ignorant.
Is it more of a leap in logic to believe in angels and demons, or that everything came from nothing, Pierce? That order came from chaos, that life emerged from a non-life, and that mind formed from mindless matter?
Definitely the belief in angels and demons, because there are no data that support the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons. And all the data that do exist point quite strongly to their being a product of sociocultural invention and curation. Meanwhile, all those other things you named have very robust models that explain how they got to be the way they are, models that are supported, again, by experimental data, by observational data, by mathematical equations, by computer simulations. And the ridiculous attempt to try to drag them down to the level of a religious dogma just to be able to assert this epistemological parity is very clearly sophomoric rhetorical prophylaxis for the fact that the belief in the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons is just a dogma that one chooses to accept, not because of the data, but in spite of the data.
I would say these are answers that arguably, in terms of the topic of what we're, on the eve of Easter, the resurrection is not one more absurdity. Neither are angels or demons.
Whether one wants to call it an absurdity or not, what it demonstrably is a dogma that you cannot support with any data, because it is not something you arrived at by following the data. It's a dogma you chose to accept, again, entirely in spite of the data, which is why you're forced to engage in these ridiculous apologetic attempts to tear down scientific inquiry, to try to make it seem like it's on the same epistemological level with those dogmas that you choose to accept.
But the resurrection, I think, actually is the explanation that makes sense of the supernatural world that we see talked about in, all sorts of religious perspectives.
Whatever one might understand it to mean, to say that the resurrection is the explanation that makes sense of the supernatural world that we see talked about in all sorts of religious perspectives, what it is not is any kind of evidentiary support for the reality of angels and demons, because none exists.
And I think that people will assume that the supernatural can't exist.
Again, people will draw from all the available data the conclusion that the supernatural world is not supported by any data and is best explained as a product of sociocultural invention and curation. That is a very different thing from an assumption.
And yet, at the exact same time, they will, as a conscious human being in a world where we're still not really entirely sure what consciousness is, try to explain logically some of these things.
Because they can be explained logically, and those explanations can be backed up with experimental data, with observational data, with mathematical equations, with computer simulations. None of that can be said of the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons.
When, the rules of logic exist objectively, and yet they are outside of time and matter and space.
Which is a philosophical curiosity that does not really have any relevance to the question of whether or not the data support the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons.
And so there are obviously things that things like science and secular materialism can't account for. And I have no qualms saying that supernatural beings exist in light of this very strange supernatural world that we live in.
So again, and for the final time, what's going on here is that Wes is completely unable to provide any actual data or evidence for the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons, and instead is going to engage in a little bit of an apologetic puppet show to make people who believe in supernatural beings like angels and demons feel like that belief is just as valid as the natural sciences. And the way to do that is not to, again, provide any evidence for the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons, but to tear down the natural sciences and to try to perform the confidence and conviction that both fields are on the same epistemological level, that there is a level playing field. And to do this, Wes has to ignore the fact that all of the things he brings up about how the world got to be the way that it is actually have very robust explanations, again, that are supported by experimental data, by observational data, by mathematical equations, by computer simulations, by all these things. But because those explanations don't fit with a supernatural worldview and what the Bible says, Wes is entirely ignoring them without comment and asserting that the natural sciences just don't have explanations for these things, which again is a laughable falsehood. But if the natural sciences don't have explanations, there are gaps in their epistemology. And so Wes is saying the natural sciences are comfortable in their worldview despite those gaps, despite not being able to account for these things. And since they're on the same epistemological level, you can be perfectly comfortable in your supernatural worldview, even though there's not just a gap, there is a complete and utter absence of explanations, data, evidence for the reality of supernatural beings like angels and demons. So it is an apologetic, rhetorical puppet show to try to make people feel like, oh, we're both on the same level. They're doing fine, so I guess I'm doing fine as well. And in this way, Wes can make people who believe in the reality of angels and demons feel validated in that belief without even providing any actual evidence for the reality of angels and demons. Again, it's an apologetic puppet show. And the fit for this video has been Wolverine in his correct uniform.